I'm now going to be talking about the biochemical cycles of matter. I'm going to be doing the first half of it tonight and do the next half the other day. This is covering AP Framework sections 1.4 and 1.7. So what do living things need from the environment to survive? They need basically nutrients and energy. So that's what we're going to talk about. How does matter move among the living organisms and non-living parts of the ecosystem? How does energy move among living and non-living things? And why would matter and energy need to cycle through such an ecosystem? Why? Because everything is limited. We only have so much water. We only have so much carbon. What we got 3.5 billion years ago is 5.5 billion years ago is basically what we have now. This is all there is. And this is going to be the cycles that we're going to be talking about. All matter is limited. We only have a certain amount of matter. It's the same. We've had the same matter on the planet Earth basically forever, for 4.5 billion years. If the number of life-sustaining resources are limited, how have we been able to evolve and keep on going for billions and billions of years? How? By recycling. Yeah, that's a good thing to do in AP Environmental Science. Let's recycle and reuse. Energy and matter. Energy flows through the system, and matter is recycled and recycled and recycled through all these cycles. We're going to be talking about the biogeochemical cycles, where non-living nutrients, abiotic materials, are going to be moving through the biotic systems. So, the main components are going to be source and sink. A source is basically where something comes from. It releases more nutrients than it accepts, whereas a sink is the long-term residence of it. For example, with coal, that would be petroleum products, where it accepts lots and lots of nutrients and doesn't release them possibly for long periods of time. With the water cycle, which parts of Earth's spheres are water found? All of them. They can be found everywhere. It is water connects every sphere, and it cycles all together. So why do things need water to survive? If you remember from biology, basically we need it to maintain homeostasis. If we sweat, the energy to make the water molecules evaporate comes from our body, and therefore we cool off. We also use it to break apart materials so we can obtain energy. For example, in photosynthesis and cellular respiration, the water is used to help put together ATP so that we can use that for energy. So what is so strange about this picture? That is the planet Earth with all the water that is on it. If we look at it, even though water is covering 71% of the Earth's surface, that is all the water that is existing on the planet Earth. 97%, that great big huge blue thing, that's all salt water. 97% of the water on our planet is salt water, and we can't drink it. Whereas if we look at fresh water, which is less than much lower concentrations, salt concentration, about 2.5 to 3.5%, 0.76% is groundwater, which we can get to. 0.0132 is in lakes and streams, which we can get to. The vast majority of fresh water, however, is in glaciers and ice caps, which we can't get to. That means the fresh water has to be recycled over and over and over again so that we can get to it. So, the water cycle. Water cycled as gas, liquid, and solid. Why? Because we're in the Goldilocks zone of our solar system, where it can exist as all three parts. You need to, as we go through this, as you continue with this, you need to write down the definition of each term. In other words, you need to pause it and write down the definition, and you need to be able to draw and label each part of the water cycle. So evaporation. Evaporation comes when water goes from liquid form to gas form. It requires energy. Why? Because it's increasing the water molecule's kinetic energy. And what supplies that energy? The sun. Now, what's interesting is the sunlight powering the water system powers a lot of the other systems. Now, condensation is basically where it goes from water vapor into water droplets. Now, if evaporation is equal to condensation, we get clouds. If condensation is faster than evaporation, we're going to get precipitation. Precipitation, basically whatever goes up has to come down eventually. How many different types of precipitation are there? Well, we know there's rain, sleet, snow, and hail. Why are there so many different types? And what is the cause of different types? The temperature. So if we have a storm front coming in, pushing the warm air from the left towards the right, this direction, we're going to have rain coming down. Even though it may be, depending on the height of the clouds, it may be ice crystals up there. But as it comes down, it's going to warm up. However, as it goes down, if it goes underneath the warm section and goes into the cold area, it may transfer from freezing rain to sleet, which are little, basically ice pellets, to snow. All of these are different types of precipitation. Now, once water gets down, one of the things it does, it goes into the ground. That's called infiltration. When it just goes into the soil, that's called infiltration. When it goes down into the rock, it's called percolation, where it goes between the rocks down deeper and deeper and deeper down into the groundwater. That's called percolation. Make sure you're drawing. Groundwater is called aquifers. Aquifers are basically where it's down below, and oftentimes there is some bedrock down here, and the aquifer is the water underneath. If you have an open portion up through the top, you will have an artesian well where it will come up and spray. Oftentimes, however, there is going to be above that is where most of the people get their well water. It's above the bedrock. So if it rains on a plant and the plant gets the water, how does the water get from the plant back to the earth? It's called transpiration. The way I remember that is it's basically trees evaporating or undergoing respiration. So trees undergoing respiration is transpiration, where the water comes up through the roots, goes up through the xylem, and out through the pores on the bottom of the leaf. What happens here? What phase of matter are you not seeing? If we look at dry ice, that's solid. If we look at that white fluffy stuff, that's basically a gas. That is called sublimation, where we go from a solid directly to a vapor. That's what happens frequently in Antarctica or the Arctic, where it doesn't melt, it just undergoes sublimation and goes directly from the ice up to the vapor. So, stop. Could you label and describe each portion of the water cycle? Good. The carbon cycle. Carbon cycle basically is where carbon in the atmosphere, generally as CO2, is cycled around. So CO2 in the atmosphere is one of the major places where it stays. But how do plants obtain it? Well, one of the things that happens is we undergo photosynthesis, either on land or in the ocean. Both places have photosynthesis that happens. And when that happens, it grabs the CO2, combines it with water from the other cycle, so with water and that's how we get food. This is all in the presence of sun that supplies the energy. Now, how do heterotrophs get their carbon? Well, one of the things we're going to do is we're going to eat. We're going to eat those plants or those autotrophs, and what we're going to do is then we're going to breathe out. We're undergoing respiration and returning the CO2 either to the atmosphere or back into the ocean, depending on whether we're land or water organisms. Now, what do heterotrophs use the carbon for? One of the things we do is we use it for cellular respiration. We take that sugar, we combine it with oxygen, and we get CO2, water, and ATP, again, so that we can function. What do dead organisms do when they die? They basically undergo decomposition and they float to the bottom of it. Either they die on the land or they go to the bottom of the ocean. If that happens, it can lay down, and over time we can get carbonate rocks forming. And eventually, over thousands if not millions of years, we can get fossil fuels. So how does the carbon go through all of this? Other things that can happen is we can get erosion, where the CO2 through erosion or from volcanic activity can return to the atmosphere. Humans returned fossil fuels, the CO2 from fossil fuels, by the burning of fossil fuels up into the atmosphere also. So, would you be able to correctly label and describe each portion of this carbon cycle? Can you identify the major sources and sinks of the carbon cycle? For example, the sources would be like burning fossil fuels, volcanoes, slash and burn deforestation, like what's happening up in the mountains right now. Sinks are forests and oceans, where it goes down there and it sometimes comes out. Both oceans and forest and land can be sources and sinks. For example, the forest will maintain the carbon in their structure for long periods of time, or the CO2 will go into the ocean and may be in there for long periods of time, combining with calcium to form seashells, calcium carbonate. Now, oceans and ecosystems act as both sources and sinks. And so, as climate change is happening, we're getting more and more CO2 into the ocean. Well, when CO2 combines with water, it forms H2CO3, carbonic acid. Well, the problem with carbonic acid is that it's acidic. Not like the soda that you have, but it becomes acidic. And acidity in the ocean can be bad. Why? Because it releases the hydrogen ions. And those hydrogen ions can combine with organisms in the ocean like seafish, seashells, or coral and break them down. And what has been happening over the last 20, 30, 50 years? The amount of CO2, as the amount of CO2 keeps on going up, the pH keeps on going down and down and down, getting more and more acidic, meaning that it is breaking down coral reefs, which is not a good thing. So if we look here, we can see that there are various places where it's more acidic and more basic than others. At the equator, it's much more acidic than it is other places. And as we go through here, as we get more and more CO2, it goes about breaking down everything from seashells to snails to basically all kinds of things happening. It causes these seashells and other sea organisms to not be able to function properly. making the coral reef, like the Australian coral reef, die. Marine life is very, very sensitive. It means that they cannot reproduce. They cannot survive. The more and more basic it gets, the more of them are going to die. And that is how we are influencing negatively the carbon cycles.